I'll show you how to crochet our Marika swancho pattern step by step, and by the end of this video, you will have an easygoing sweater to enjoy year-round. Hey there, I'm Jess from Make and Do Crew, and we've designed this pattern for you in sizes extra small through 5X. Well, I'm going to walk you through all the techniques and skills you need for this pattern. You'll also want to follow along with the written pattern to know the exact stitch counts for your size. The links to the pattern and supplies can be found right below this video in the description box. I'm using Lion Brand's 24/7 cotton for this pattern, which is a category 4 worsted weight yarn according to the label, but I find it to be on the thin side. It's a bit more like a heavy DK weight yarn. So if you do choose to substitute yarns, it's important to check your gauge. It's always important to check your gauge, so don't skip that step. But for sure, if you're substituting yarn, you're going to want to look for a lighter worsted weight yarn or a heavy DK. And I've included some yarn substitution ideas in the written pattern. I'm using a 5.5mm hook, which is a size I, but again, it's always okay to change your hook size based on the gauge to make sure you're meeting the gauge listed in the pattern, because that's what's going to guarantee your sweater turns out the size that you expect. I'm starting with a foundation chain of 55 stitches, but the number you'll need depends on the size that you're making, so check the written pattern for that stitch count. And then to begin row 1, I am skipping my first chain so that I can single crochet in the second chain from my hook. And then I want to chain 3 stitches, and I'm going to skip the next 3 chains. So I already worked into this one. We're gonna skip 1, 2, 3, and then work into that 4th one with a single crochet. So I've created a little chain 3 space here, and this is going to become an essential component of this pattern. Again, we're going to chain 3, and this time we're just going to skip 2 chains down below. So make sure not to count that one you already worked in. And then I've got 1 and 2, and I'm going to single crochet in the next stitch. Again, I'm going to chain 3, and again, I'm going to skip 3 chains now, 1, 2, 3, and single crochet. So each time we are chaining 3 with our working yarn. So we've got 3 chains up here, but we're alternating skipping 3 chains and then 2 chains and then skipping 3 chains and 2 chains. So I just skipped 3, so now I want to skip the next 2 and place a single crochet in the next chain. Again, I will chain 3 and now skip 3 chains, 1, 2, 3. Again, chain 3. So what we're doing up above is always chaining 3, but down below we're alternating by skipping 3 chains and then skipping 2 chains. So I just skipped 3, so now I'm going to skip 2 and put that single crochet in there. And we're going to repeat this sequence across the first row. So that's chaining 3 and skipping 3, then placing a single crochet in the next stitch, and then chaining 3 and skipping 2. And if you have any questions as you're crocheting, join our Make and Do Crew Facebook group, because that is where I hang out, and there are so many friendly crocheters who are willing to answer your questions and honestly just admire your stitches. So even if you don't have a question, I would love for you to share a photo of your work in progress, either in the Facebook group or on Instagram. Just make sure to tag us, because I love admiring what you make. And at the end of row 1, we are going to finish by skipping 3 chains, 1, 2, 3, and then I've already chained 3 up here, so I'm going to single crochet into the last chain. And at this point, for my size, I have 15 chain 3 spaces. The number of chain 3 spaces that you have is going to vary by size, but when I refer to a chain 3 space, I'm just talking about this little window right here. So it's a good idea to count these and make sure you're on track, because this is what's going to establish the spacing for our next row. Before we move on to row 2, can you do me a quick favor and leave a comment below with the yarn you're using to make this pattern? I love for the comment sections of our videos to become a resource for other crocheters so that they can find a yarn substitute if they don't have access to 24/7 or if they want to use something else. It's so helpful if you leave a comment with the yarn you're using so that other people can try it out too. Thank you. To begin row 2, we are going to start with 3 chains, and this is going to count as a double crochet throughout the pattern. So now I'm going to turn and work in the opposite direction. In this pattern, we're going to call this the right side, and you'll see why, because we'll have the right side of our double crochets facing, and those look nice when you can see the front of them. So from here, we're going to work 4 double crochets in this first chain 3 space. 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're going to just call that a double crochet cluster throughout this pattern, because a cluster is usually a grouping of stitches, and so we're going to work in these groups of 4 double crochets. Now we want to chain 1 and just double crochet in our next space. So we're going to be alternating these 4 double crochet clusters with these single double crochets, and we're always going to separate them by a space, a chain space. So now I'm going to chain again and put 4 double crochets in my next chain 3 space. And these are the main elements of our pattern repeat for all of our even number rows. So we've got 2 double crochets, 3, and 4. And just like I did right before this, I'm going to chain 1 and then double crochet in my next chain 3 space. And we're just going to continue like this across the row. So after this, I chain 1, and then again, I'm going to put 4 double crochets in this space. You may find that your double crochet kind of looks like it's really off to one side of your chain 3 space, but that will all even out, especially when we block this, but it just looks a little wonky like that. Putting my stitches in over here will sort of pull it over to the other side. So I'm going to put 4 double crochets here, and then again, chain 1, double crochet in the next chain 3 space, and then again, chain 1 and put 4 double crochets in the next chain 3 space. And we're going to repeat this sequence, working a cluster of 4 double crochets, chain, and then a double crochet in the next space, chain, 4 double crochets, and so on across the rest of this row. At the end of row 2, I've worked 4 double crochets in my last chain 3 space, and then I want to finish off this row with 1 double crochet in my single crochet from the previous row. So that's just my last stitch right here. I'm having a hard time catching those loops, but there I've got it. And now we should have a symmetrical row. They will not always be symmetrical in this pattern because we're going to start increasing in a bit, but for now we have an ending here with a double crochet and then a 4 double crochet cluster, and we should also have a beginning over here that has a double crochet and then a 4 double crochet cluster. So that's one way to check to make sure you're on the right track. Another way is to count your 4 double crochet clusters here. Make sure you have the correct stitch count. That's why those chain spaces and counting them was important in the previous row. It's just always better to catch those mistakes sooner rather than later. And counting is one of the easiest ways to prevent a mistake. So now we're going to move on to row 3, and in row 3 we're going to do something quite similar to what we did in row 1. We're going to create these little chain spaces. So to begin that, I'm just going to chain 1 and turn and work back. This is a wrong side row. So we'll put a single crochet in my first stitch. So that's just the top of that double crochet. And now we want to chain 3. And then we're going to put a single crochet in the next chain space. So this is going to feel quite familiar because it really is a similar cadence to how we started in row 1. So I've got 3 chains again, and now I'm going to put a single crochet in my next chain space, and then again chain 3, and as I come over here I'm going to single crochet in that chain space, again chain 3, hop right over this double crochet and work into that chain space. So if you're looking at the written pattern right now, you're going to see that this row looks more complex because there's mentions of skipping over the 4 double crochets and working into the next space and then skipping over the next double crochet, and that is just there for clarity, but all you really need to keep in mind is that you're chaining 3 and then single crocheting in the next space. So as long as you're only working into the spaces, you're golden, because you'll by definition just be skipping all these stitches that you need to. So again, I've got 3 chains on my hook, and I'm just going to work into my next chain space, and I'm just going to continue like that until I get to the end of the row. And I have my last 3 chains here, so I'm going to just skip over my final double crochet cluster and just work into the top of this turning chain where we started the previous row. So now I have a bunch more chain 3 spaces, and we're going to work back into these now in row 4. To begin row 4, we're going to chain 4 stitches, and every time we chain 4, that's going to count as 1 double crochet and 1 chain 1 space. So now we'll turn and work in this direction. We've got a right side row going, and we are going to continue in the same pattern of double crochet clusters and then some spaces with a single double crochet and then a cluster, spaces with a single double crochet. But because of the way this stitch repeat works, we're alternating the spacing. So right now we want our single double crochet to go over our cluster from a couple rows before, and then we're going to put a 4 double crochet cluster here. So one of the ways you can make sure you're on track in this pattern is to look down below, not in the previous row, but 2 rows back. So right here, the last time I worked a right side row, and I see here that I've got a cluster. So that means now I want just a single double crochet above it. This will become very intuitive after we work a couple more rows. So I've got my first double crochet. Now I want to chain 1, and then in my next chain 3 space I want to put 4 double crochets. So you can see anytime down below I see 4 double crochets, I'm going to work a single double crochet, and then anytime I see a single double crochet down below, I want to put a 4 double crochet cluster up above. See how those are alternating? So now above this cluster I want to just chain 1 and put my double crochet in there, and then chain 1 again and put 4 double crochet in the next space. So let's take a look at that. You can see that pattern starting to emerge where we're alternating a double crochet up here above this cluster, and then above the single double crochet we have 4 double crochets. So we're going to continue in that repeat across this row, placing 4 double crochets in a space and then working a chain 1 and a single double crochet, and then another chain 1, and then 4 double crochets. We're going to work like this till we get to our last chain space, and I'll show you how to end this row. At my last chain space here, I can see that what's down below is a 4 double crochet cluster, which means I just want a single double crochet here. So I've already chained 1, and I'm going to put that last double crochet right here, and then chain 1, and then work a final double crochet into the top of this single crochet from the previous row. So again, because we haven't increased yet, the beginning and end of the row are symmetrical. So I've got that single double crochet with some spaces on the side right here, and then I've got the same thing to start my row over here. In row 5, we're going to work one of these types of rows where we're creating these chain 3 spaces, but because we want to increase, we're going to be adding an extra chain 3 space at the beginning of the row. That's what's going to create our increase. So I'm chaining 1 and then working back in the opposite direction. And we're going to work a bunch of stitches right now right into our very first stitch, which is this double crochet. So I'm going to start with a single crochet here, and then I'm going to chain 3. So this is our new increase here, and then I'm going to work back into the same double crochet, and I'm going to just single crochet right there. Okay, so we've taken care of our increase. Now we can carry on by chaining 3 and then single crocheting into our space right here. So we're skipping over this first space, but we are going to work into the next space. And now we are basically back in the pattern that we worked in row 3. So I'm chaining 3 and then working into my next space. And then again, chaining 3, working into the next space, just skipping right over that double crochet. And then again, chain 3, working into my next space, and I'm just going to carry on like this until I get to the end of the row. And to finish, I've got my chain 3 right here, so I'm just going to work into basically the third chain here of this chain 4. So you can either count 3 chains and insert your hook and work into that, or if you're kind of lazy like me, you can just insert your hook in that space and it'll sort of find its natural spot. So that's how I like to do it. And now you should count the number of chain 3 spaces you have and just verify it with a written pattern. It should be 1 more chain 3 space than you had at the very beginning, because we increased over here. And now to proceed with row 6, this is technically called an increase row also, because we're going to add some extra stitches over here where we increased at the beginning of row 5. But really the work of increasing kind of happened in row 5. So if you're looking at the written pattern right now, it's telling you that you want to repeat the same instructions that we did in row 2. And then it's going to give us some different instructions for finishing this row. So that means we can go back to row 2 in the written pattern and work the same thing until we get to the end of the row. So if we look down here at row 2, we started with this 4 double crochet cluster, which makes sense to do again because, like I said, we're always alternating in each row. So we've done 4 double crochet cluster, we have our single double crochet, and now we're ready for a 4 double crochet cluster again up here. So after you have chain 3, we are going to put those 4 double crochets in our first chain space. And then now we are going to chain 1 and then work a single double crochet here. Again, we're mimicking what we did in row 2. So we've got that 1 stitch and then a chain. And then we can carry on like this across the row. So again, I can look down here and see it's 4 double crochets. Also, I know that because I just worked a single double crochet, so it makes sense that in our repeat, I would put 4 stitches in my next space and then carry on like this in the same repeat across the row. And now with 2 spaces left here, I've got this chain 3 space and then this extra one that we increased. I'm going to work 4 double crochets into the second to last one, and that's just what I would do naturally in the pattern because I just did my single double crochet. So I've got 4 stitches to put here, and then we're going to end the row slightly differently, and that's what's going to be considered our increase. So here I've got 3 stitches. Okay, that's 4. So now I just want to chain 1 like I typically would, and we're going to put our 1 double crochet right in that chain space. So that's all sort of typical. But then we are going to just work 1 final double crochet in the top of this single crochet from where we started. So it's a little hard to see because all of these stitches are sort of packed together. But if you look right here, my first V, that's the top of that single crochet. So I'm just going to pop this last double crochet in there. And what that means is that we're ending our row, staying in the pattern until our last chain 3 space. And at that point, we're just adding a chain right here and then essentially working 2 double crochets, 1 into that chain 3 space and then 1 into the end of our row, which is that single crochet. And now our increase rows are complete. So you can see actually already that we've added some stitches and this is starting to flare out. So what I like to do just to kind of help myself stay on track and even know what row I'm on and also just monitor where my increases are going, I like to put a stitch marker where I started my increase. So in this case, I would put it in row 5 right here because that's where I added that extra chain 3 space. So that just marks for me, that's where my increase happened. And then I can always catch myself if all of a sudden I have 2 stitch markers really close together, it means I probably made a mistake because in this pattern, the increase rows are spread out evenly. So you should see your stitch markers at an even cadence as you work. So now we're going to work a few rows without increasing. And something to note about these, we're working in the same pattern that we did down here to get started, but now that we've increased, our rows are not going to begin and end in the same way. So previously, if we had this 4 double crochet cluster at the beginning of the row, we would have the same thing, or at the beginning of the row here, we'd have the same thing at the end of the row. That's not going to be true now because we're a little bit off count just because we did this increase. So I'll show you what that looks like, but I would like to point that out because if you're relying on that alone to stay on track, it's going to be confusing. But since you're not relying on only that, you'll be just fine. So to begin row 7, we are going to chain 1 and then turn this around. So we're working a wrong side row again, and we're just going to single crochet into our first double crochet. So that's pretty obvious here. And then I want to just again chain 3. And then I am going to put my next single crochet in the first chain space. So this is all fairly intuitive because it's quite similar to what we've done in previous rows. I've got that first chain 3 space established, and then again I'm just going to chain 3 and single crochet in the next space, and then chain 3 and single crochet in the next space, and we're going to continue like that across the row. Then I've got 3 chains here, so I'm just going to finish up by inserting my hook. I just, again, like to work right under that turning chain, but if you're a stickler, you can put it through the 3rd chain there to work your final single crochet. And now in row 8, we're going to do the same thing we did in row 4, but just end it slightly differently. So we're starting here with a chain 4. There we go. If you remember back to row 4, that's going to count as our first double crochet in our first chain 1 space, because if we look right here, we have a 4 double crochet cluster in the previous section. So I am going to work a double crochet right here and then a chain. And then in my next chain 3 space, I'm going to put 4 double crochet, and we're going to work across this row in that pattern, just as we have until we get to our last chain 3 space. And as we have that last chain space, I've already chained 1 here after my 1 double crochet. So now I'm going to put 4 double crochets in that last space. And there's really nothing peculiar about this. The only reason it looks complicated in the written pattern is because the row is not beginning and ending in the same way. So there's just more to say in the instructions, but actually all we're doing is continuing in the same pattern that we've done all along, which is these clusters alternated by a 1 double crochet with some spaces on the side. So it's really no different at all, but it takes a lot of technical writing to document that in a pattern. So now I'm going to work a final double crochet into my last stitch. So that's into the single crochet from the previous row. And at this point, we are going to work our chain 3 spaces. So in row 9, I'm going to chain 1 and single crochet in the top of that first stitch, and then chain 3. And then again, I'm just going to single crochet in my next space, chain 3 and single crochet in my next space, and work like this across the row. In the written pattern, you're going to be coming across a phrase that I want to explain here, and it is something that says ending last repeat, and then it shows 2 asterisks. So this can feel so confusing, and it honestly, it's intimidating to me when I see it in a pattern, but it is quite straightforward, and all it's saying is that we don't want you to get confused and think that you're just going to end this row maybe the way you started it, or to be actually technically correct, we want you to know that you're ending it at a certain point in our phrase of instructions. So all that means in this case, when it says ending last repeat of these 2 asterisks, it's just that we're ending the repeat after we skip 4 double crochets. It's nothing more complicated than that. And then it says, okay, after that, we are going to chain 3 and just put our final single crochet in the top of that turning chain. So a lot of times those written instructions can feel a lot more complicated than they actually are, and that's the beauty of having a video tutorial to look at the same time, because you can see here we're working in a very repeatable pattern. There's not a lot of deviations from what we're doing, but when you look at the pattern, each row looks a little bit different and it sounds a little bit different. Actually, it's just explaining that we're doing the same thing. We're making each row look the same over and over and over again. So let's continue with row 10. In row 10, we are going to repeat what we did in row 2. So all that means is we're starting with a chain 3 and then putting 4 double crochets in our first space, and then carrying on in the repeat that we've established until we get to the end of the row where we have 1 chain 3 space remaining. And we're just going to end it a little differently than we did in row 2, which is why the instructions deviate at that point and tell you to do something differently. So let's work across that row, and I'll meet you there and we'll finish the row together. We've got a 4 double crochet cluster in 2 rows down here, which means we want to put 1 double crochet here. So I'm going to chain 1 and then place that double crochet in my chain 3 space, chain 1, and then finish my row with 1 double crochet. As you notice here, our rows are beginning and ending in a different way, but that is about to change because we're going to increase again. So we're going to get back to a cadence where the rows begin and end in the same way. And that is just a result of increasing the number of stitches we have in this row. So in between each increased section, we are working 4 rows. So we're ready to increase again. And part of the way you can just make sure you're on track in the pattern is I have my stitch marker here. So that indicates row 5, and then here is row 6. That's this taller row. And then I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 rows. So that just helps me double check in the pattern I'm in the right spot and I'm ready to increase again. So if you remember how we did that the previous time, we start by chaining 1 and we're going to create that extra chain 3 space at the very beginning of our row. So to do that, I'm just going to start with a single crochet and then chain 3 and then work a single crochet right here back into that first stitch. So now I've increased, I've got that extra chain 3 space established, and I'm going to chain 3 and then single crochet into the next chain space and then chain 3 and work across the row just as we have in all the other odd number rows. To end row 11, I'm just going to single crochet into the top of that turning chain. And now in row 12, again, it's marked as an increase row, but we're not doing that until we get way over here to the beginning where we added that chain 3 space. So we can begin it just like we do any other even row, or at least an even row on this side. So we're going to do that with a chain 4 and then work back in the opposite direction in the same pattern we've established, starting with a double crochet in that first chain space, chaining 1, and then putting 4 double crochet in the next space. We're going to continue like that, and I will meet you at the end of this row where that extra chain 3 space is. And if you're following along super closely in the written pattern, it says to end our last repeat at the double asterisk. So we've chained 1 and we're ending our repeat now, and we're sort of deviating by putting a double crochet in that last chain 3 space, and then 1 more double crochet in the top of our last stitch. So that's a single crochet that we're working into. So this is exactly how we ended our increase row right down here. So again, I'm going to put a stitch marker. I like to put it in the first increase row, so that's just popping it right here in that extra chain 3 space we created. And now all of your increase sections should be about this far apart. It's just one way to make sure you're on track. And now we're going to work a section of non-increase rows again. And to begin row 13, we want to chain 1, single crochet in our first double crochet there, chain 3, and then we're going to put a single crochet in our next space and then carry on just like we have previously across this row. And at the end of row 13, I'm going to finish with a single crochet in my turning chain here. And I'm going to flip this around so we can see this beautiful right side. What is so cool here is that you know all the skills needed to work the rest of your increase sections, because we're just going to be repeating a bunch of rows that we've already established at this point. So you can check out the pattern to know exactly which rows those are, but it's something that you've already done by getting to this point. So there's nothing new to learn for a while. You can just sit back and do a little cruise control crochet. So relaxing. And we're going to be increasing at this cadence we've established here. So we're going to have 4 rows in between where we're not increasing, and then we're going to increase for 2 rows, and we're going to repeat like that. And you can check the written pattern to know the exact number of increase sections you're going to have, but all of us, regardless of the size you're making, are just going to continue repeating these rows now. And so we're creating a piece of fabric that is getting slightly wider, and this is going to accommodate your shoulders. And when we get up here, we're going to be working even for a section, which just means working a section of rows back and forth where we don't decrease or increase. But your first step is just to complete your increase rows, and the number again is listed in the written pattern, but you now have all the skills you need to do those. So dive in confidently and enjoy a bit of relaxing crocheting as you finish up your increase section. This is what your piece should look like when your increase section is complete. So we've got this little slant up here, and then we're going to work even, which means just working back and forth in the pattern repeat without decreasing or increasing. So we're going to do that for a long section here, and you're just going to do our 4-row repeat. It's 4 rows in this section because we don't need to accommodate an increase. So it's quite straightforward because you've been doing it all along. The only difference now is that you don't have to do anything special at the end or beginning of any rows because we're not increasing. So you're going to work a section like that, the number of rows in which is going to vary depending on your size. And then we're going to get over here where we start decreasing. This is what the decreases are going to look like. So I want to walk you through this before we go step by step through each row so that you understand what we're looking for. You can see these are just typical rows worked back and forth in our pattern. And then I've marked the place where I am going to begin my decrease. So this is one of those rows where we're creating chain 3 spaces. And the decrease is happening here when we eliminate one of those chain 3 spaces. So this row right above my marker is where my decrease happens. And you can tell because it juts in a little bit. You can see clearly some stitches have been taken away. So the way we're accomplishing that decrease is by skipping over a chain 3 space and using a treble crochet at the end of the row. So I will talk you through that step by step now, but I wanted to show you what we're doing so that you can kind of visualize it working into the stitch pattern that we've already learned. And we have so many new, fun, simple garments like this coming out in the next few months. So if you're enjoying this tutorial, I would love it if you subscribed so that you don't miss any of our future patterns. Now we're jumping back into my in progress piece. So I'll show you how to complete these decrease rows step by step. And what I've completed here is my first row of the decrease section, and I didn't need to demonstrate that for you because it is the same thing we've been doing all along. We're just accounting for it in the decrease section now. That just makes our row repeat a bit easier. So it's a little easier from a pattern writing perspective, but what's important to know is nothing is different in row 1. You're doing the same thing you've been doing all along. So I have my chain 3 spaces, and then to begin row 2 of my decrease section, I'm going to continue in the same pattern we've been doing. Hopefully the fact that I keep saying we're doing the same thing we've been doing is going to give you lots of confidence to finish this up because you have learned almost all the skills that you need to in order to make your swancho. So to begin this row, just as we would anytime we see a cluster of 4, 2 rows below, I'm just going to work a chain 4 and then double crochet in that first space. And then I'm just going to continue like this across the row, just as we have previously, but I'm going to stop when I have 2 chain 3 spaces left. We're going to leave those unworked for a second, and I'll show you how to finish up this row to create that decrease. And here we are with 2 of our chain 3 spaces left. So I've already worked a chain stitch here, just as we would to continue in our pattern. And I'm going to put a double crochet in my second to last chain space. So that is keeping with our typical pattern, but instead of working a cluster of 4 in my last space, I'm actually going to skip right over it and put a treble crochet in my last stitch. So a treble crochet is nice and long, and that's going to accommodate this big stretchy space that we need to cover in order to join this side here. And what that creates is this little slanted trapezoid, and that is our decrease. So as I showed you before, when we work a couple more rows here, we're going to see that this slopes in, and over time, especially when we seam our 2 pieces, the back and front together, any jaggedness of this is going to be smoothed out, and what you'll have is a nice slope for your shoulder. So to continue now, the next row, it's written a bit differently in the pattern just because technically it's slightly different than what we've done before, but honestly, as you'll see, it's very similar to what we've been doing all along. So I'm going to chain 1, and again, we're working with the wrong side facing now because this is one of our chain rows. So I'm just going to put a single crochet in that first stitch there, and then I'm going to chain 3 and skip right over this double crochet. So I'm putting my first single crochet into my first chain space, which all feels pretty typical, I would say. This is where pattern written instructions look lots more complicated than they actually are. So we've created our first chain 3 space, and then I'm just going to continue in the pattern that we've been doing all along, where I chain 3 and then single crochet into each chain space, and we're going to work to the end of the row just like we typically would. And at the end of this row, I'm going to pop this over so we can be looking at the right side. So we've now worked 3 rows in our decrease section. The one that we started with, where we put our stitch marker, then our actual decrease here, and then 1 more of chain 3 spaces. And each section in this slope downward is going to be a 6-row repeat. So it's just like we did in our increase section, where we were repeating 6 rows over and over again in order to create that upward slope. Now we're going to repeat 6 rows over and over again to create the mirror image of that with a downward slope. And so we've worked 3 rows at this point. In order to work the next 3, we're just working in the pattern we've established. So I'm not going to demonstrate that because I know at this point you worked a lot of these rows. I know you know how to do it. So you would work the 3 next rows, and that should put you back here working a row 1, which will be this chain 3 space. So then you'll start with that row and repeat your 6-row decrease sequence again, and you'll do that the number of times listed for your size in the pattern. And as you come upon the end of this piece total, you've worked all your decreases, we're going to finish off with a chain 3 space row, and that is to make the ending, this side over here, the same sort of row as we started with. So if you remember, we started with a chain 3 space row, we're going to end with it, and then you can fasten off and leave a very long tail because we're going to use it again for seaming when we seam up the sides here. Instead of adding a new piece of yarn, we're just going to weave in our yarn tail and seam at the same time. When that decrease section is complete, you should have something that looks like this with a beautiful curve, and if you folded it in half, it should be symmetrical. So that's one way to just check, make sure that you have the right number of rows, and you can even line up your stitch markers just to make sure you have the exact same number. That's one reason why I like to just keep them in all along. It helps me not have to do quite so much counting because I know that they're already placed at the right interval, and I can use them as sort of mile markers. Isn't that so fun and beautiful? I would love it if you shared pictures of your in progress Marika Swancho on social media, and be sure to tag Make and Do Crew because I really want to admire your stitches. You are ready for a super relaxing go of it because you get to repeat the exact same instructions to make a second crescent like this. So we're going to make symmetrical backs and fronts, and then we will meet back here and I will show you how to join them. Our next step is to seam the shoulder slope. So this downward slope on both sides of our big rectangle piece, we're going to seam our 2 pieces together, but obviously we need to leave an opening for the neck. The pattern offers recommendations for the neck opening to leave. So that means the number of rows you're going to keep open to put your head through. But of course, this is something you can customize. So I highly recommend, if you're making this for yourself, pinning these two pieces together. You can pin them along the slopes here and trying it on and seeing if you like the suggested neck opening. If you want it to be something that can slouch off your shoulder, leave a few more rows unseamed. If you want it a bit tighter, then obviously you can bring that neckline in. Right now I have 29 rows here between my stitch markers, and these stitch markers are indicating where my seam is going to stop. So this is my neck opening. It's 29 total rows, counting the double crochet rows and the chain 3 space rows. And what's most important when you're placing the stitch markers for this is that they are at a symmetrical point in your piece. So one thing you can do just to double check your work is fold this in half, and then you should have those stitch markers there where your increases and decreases are, and you can use those to guide and make sure that you indeed have put your neckline in the middle of your big rectangle. Once you're happy with the placement of your neckline stitch markers, it's time to set our two pieces together to seam them. And we want to have the right side facing in for this. So that means we want to be seeing the front of all those double crochets. That's the right side. So we want the right side of this piece touching the right side of this piece. And we're going to use our stitch markers that indicate our increases and decreases to line our rectangles up here. You'll notice that because we created two symmetrical pieces, these rows are pointing in this direction, and then the ones on the bottom are pointing in this direction, at least for me. But we want to line up the double crochet rows and the chain 3 space rows so that even when the stitches are actually pointing a different direction, we have some sort of seamless look by having the thick rows line up with the thick rows and the thin rows line up with the thin rows. So what you want to do is get your piece set up here so that all of your stitch markers are lined up. The point of the stitch markers is mostly just to help you keep track so that you're not getting lost in a sea of rows. So once those are lined up, then you're going to want to use stitch markers to pin your two rectangles together. And I always like to do this because making sure your stitches are lined up is one of the main things you can do to give your garment a professional finish. It's one of the areas that it can really go wrong if your stitches aren't quite lined up or your seam is a little bunchy. It's one of the things that will end up driving you crazy about your finished piece. So it's worth taking the time to just get it right. And one of the things that I found is most helpful is just pinning your rows in place so that they don't slide around as you're actually seaming. So I'm going to put stitch markers here, making sure my rows are lined up. I'm using the stitch markers to hold them together. And you can do the same thing, and then we'll come back here and talk about how to actually work this seam. Now my pieces are pinned together, and you may be wondering if you can just use the stitch markers that are in your increases and decreases to pin this together, and obviously you can definitely do that. The reason I'm not doing that is that these are almost like sticky notes to myself. They really help me stay on track so I don't have to find my increases and decreases again if, say, I had to take this piece apart and reevaluate something. So I just like to keep them in until this whole seam is finished. And I want to use, for me, I like to use additional stitch markers because they kind of have a different job. Their job is to hold the pieces together. So one are my sticky notes and one are my actual hands, if you want to think of it that way. And I'm going to show you how to seam this together with a tapestry needle and a piece of yarn. But if you have a preferred seaming method, if you really hate sewing things like this and you want to instead maybe crochet this together with slip stitches, that's fine too. This is just one of the ways I've found to make the most seamless look at the shoulder. So I have a fresh strand of yarn on my tapestry needle because there is no tail to use here. If there was, I would definitely be using that because I don't like to add any new pieces to weave in. But because I'm adding something new, what I like to do is weave in my yarn tail ahead of time. So instead of leaving a tail hanging out and then having something to deal with later, I like to anchor it at the very beginning of my seam. And I'm going to leave this little bit here. I'll trim it off, but I'm weaving this in. And that allows me to have the yarn in an anchored spot and also never have to thread my tapestry needle again to deal with a yarn tail over here. So once I've gotten this woven back and forth through the thickest part of this double crochet cluster, I'm pretty confident that it's secured well in there. And we're going to do this seam with one strand of yarn. So I have it doubled over, but I'm only going to be using one strand for my seam. And now, because I have this little tail here, but I've already woven in my end, I can trim this off and proceed with my seam. And if you've made many of our patterns, or if you're in our No Fail Garments course, you know this is one of my most favorite methods of seaming. But what we're going to do is sort of a modification of the mattress stitch. So I'm making sure to begin right down here at the very end of my piece, and I'm going to work back and forth in a zigzag. Again, we have the wrong side of the fabric facing out here, and I'm going to work under a couple loops on this side, from the bottom up, pull my yarn through, and then work from the bottom up on this side, grabbing a couple loops of yarn and pulling that through. Now, one of the most important things we're doing here is checking along the way to make sure our rows are lined up. And then another important thing is just making the stitches fairly close together. So I don't want to skip too far ahead and make my seaming stitches too far apart, because that could result in a little bit of a gap or just a seam that doesn't sort of stretch in the most even way. So I'm just working back and forth. If these were stitches I was working into, the top of stitches instead of the side, I would just be putting seaming into each stitch. But because I'm working into these row edges, I'm just picking up about 2 strands of yarn every time I insert my needle. So I'm just working back and forth in a zigzag like this, and I'm going to continue like this all the way up to that stitch marker that indicates my neckline. And then I'm going to go ahead and weave in this end while I still have my tapestry needle attached. I'm going to weave it in because this seam will be complete. And then I want to start again from the other side, same thing, with a piece of yarn, weave in the yarn tail ahead of time, and then seam from the elbow up to the neckline. And again, weave in my yarn tail while I have my tapestry needle threaded, and then we will have the cutest little poncho cape, and we can meet back here and talk about our next steps. After both of your shoulder seams are complete, we're going to now seam the sides in order to create the armholes. So I still have my right sides facing together, and I've pinned the side of my pieces here. So the number of stitches you're going to pin is going to depend on your size, because we want to leave a certain number open here for the armhole. So you can consult the pattern for how many you're leaving open for your armhole, but now we're going to use the tail that we left a while ago and use that to seam up to that stitch marker. I am going to hold these together, and just like our shoulder seams, we're going to work back and forth in a zigzag stitch. So I'm just going to pick up a couple loops over here on the opposite corner, and then working back and forth from the bottom up, I'm going to work through this foundation chain on one side and then through both loops of the stitch, the last row over here on the opposite side. And what's important here is that we're keeping our blocks of stitches lined up. So you can see that I have these chain 3 spaces right here, and then again we've got a chain 3 right here, and you can see how these align. So we just want to make sure we're keeping those chain 3 spaces lined up, because then everything else will fall into place. And the more we can keep everything lined up, the more our seam will be invisible. So we're just going to work back and forth like this until we get to that stitch marker signifying the armhole, and then you can weave in your yarn tail because we're done with this seaming strand of yarn. Now my side seam is complete, leaving this armhole open, and I'm ready to attach my yarn to work a foundation round and get ready for my ribbing. Go ahead and turn your sweater right side out so that now you have the front of those double crochets facing. I am going to use my larger hook for this foundation round, and then we'll switch to a smaller hook for the ribbing. And I just have a slip knot here on my hook because that is one way that I like to attach my yarn. So I just insert my hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then just slip stitch it onto my piece of fabric. So that attaches it there, and then I'm just going to chain 1, and I'm going to single crochet around this whole armhole now, and we're just going to put 3 single crochet in each chain 3 space, and then we're going to skip over the single crochets that are in between. So I just did 3 single crochets there. I'm skipping this single crochet and then working 3 more single crochets here, and then Again, skipping the next stitch, 3 more single crochets. So we're just going to continue like this around the armhole, and getting an exact stitch count is not super important here. Why we're doing this is to set up the foundation that then we're going to attach our ribbing to as we work it. So it is a join as you go ribbing, and this is what we're going to be joining to. So let's finish this round, and I will meet you back here to talk about how to start that ribbing. To end this round, I've worked 3 single crochets in my last chain space, and then I just want to insert my hook under that first stitch of the round, pull up a loop, and pull it through the loop on my hook. So that's a slip stitch. And now we've joined that round and we're ready to start our ribbing. So you should have something that looks like this. And our ribbing is going to be worked back and forth in rows like this, and we're going to attach it as we go around in this foundation round. So if you've worked many of our patterns before, this is a very similar technique, and we have a whole video tutorial on this technique in detail, but I'll show you the basics of it right now. We are going to switch to a smaller hook. So if you adjusted your hook size in order to meet the gauge, you just want to go down 1 hook size from that. So I was using a 5.5 millimeter, which is an I hook. And for the ribbing, I'm going to be using an H hook, which is a 5 millimeter. To get our ribbing started, we are going to chain 17 stitches. And if you would like a longer sleeve cuff that goes closer down to your wrist, you just want to start with more chains here. And if you want a shorter sleeve cuff, then you'll start with fewer chains. But if you're not sure and you just want to replicate the look of the photos, then you want to chain 17 stitches here. I have my 17 chains here, and we're going to work this ribbing in single crochet. But once you understand this technique, you can actually use several different stitches. You can use single crochet or half double crochet or slip stitches or yarn over slip stitches, but I'm going to show you how to do this with single crochet now. First, I'm going to skip my first chain and then single crochet into each chain that I worked. It doesn't really matter which loops of your chains you're working into, but it does matter that you're consistent. So whichever you like to choose, whether it's the top loop or the back bump, whatever you do, just do the same thing in each of your chain stitches. And then it can be a good idea to count your number of single crochets, because this number should stay consistent throughout your ribbing. That's what's going to create the cleanest edge. And because I started with 17 chains, I should now have 16 single crochet. So you should have exactly 1 fewer stitches than the number of chains you started with. Now I'm going to attach this little bit of ribbing to my foundation round by slip stitching into 2 stitches. So I'm skipping this one that already has the yarn attached into it, and I'm just going to insert my hook and pull up a loop in the next stitch and then pull it through the loop on my hook. So that's 1 slip stitch. And then again, I'm going to insert my hook in the next foundation row stitch, pull up a loop and pull it through the loop on my hook. So now I have 16 single crochets plus 2 slip stitches along this edge. And we can now turn and work in the opposite direction. One thing I found as you're working ribbing like this is that it'll look the best if you always turn it the same way. So I just naturally rotate it counterclockwise, and then that puts my yarn behind my fingers and I'm ready to work into the back loop only of all of these stitches. So the back loop is always the one that's farthest away from your body, and I'm going to skip over my 2 slip stitches because I'm only working into my ribbing stitches. So that's these 16 single crochets. So I'm just working under only the back loop, pulling up a loop. So now I finished my single crochet. So that was 1 single crochet, and working in the back loop only is what creates that nice rib texture that mimics knitting. So we're just single crocheting along here, and you can do the same, and then I will meet you down at the bottom of our ribbing when there's 1 stitch remaining in your row. In our last stitch, instead of working through only the back loop, we're going to work under both of the loops of our single crochet. So it's a little fiddly to work your hook under at first when you're ribbing so small, but the reason we're going under both loops is it creates a tidier edge at the very end of your ribbing. So you're just working it like a regular old single crochet here, and then your row is complete. Again, it's a great idea just to count your stitches. Make sure you have the number that you did in the previous row, because I've found it's kind of easy to drop a stitch here or there using this technique, and you want to catch yourself doing that sooner rather than later. Row 3 is worked exactly like row 1, except for in row 1 we were working into our chain stitches, and now we're working into single crochets. So we can go through the back loop again, and I chained 1 at the beginning of this row, and now I'm going to work under the back loop only for each of these single crochets. So again, this is the loop that's furthest away from my body, and we're just going to single crochet in each stitch. You should be seeing your ribbing look fairly tight. We switched to a smaller hook because the ribbing is intended to hug your arm, and we want the stitches to be fairly small. So if it's looking really loose and airy, probably means you need to go down another hook size. As we get to the end of row 3, I want to point out where it is quite easy to accidentally skip a stitch. So this just looks like a jumbled mush of stitches, but there's actually one more single crochet here that I need to work into in order to have my 16 stitches. And you can see it's got a little bit of a V. It's just pretty pressed flat. So I want to work under that back loop and then count my stitches to make sure I have a total of 16, that I know I've picked them all up. And we're back here at this foundation row. So I've already slip stitched into this stitch right here. You can tell because it has some yarn coming out of it from the previous row. So I want to move into the next available stitch and insert my hook, pull up a loop and pull it through the loop on my hook. So that's a slip stitch. And I've now tacked my ribbing down, and I want to do one more slip stitch. If you're finding that as you work this, your ribbing is looking like it's going to be quite loose and you want it to fit a bit tighter around your arm, one thing that you can do is work more than 2 slip stitches for joining your yarn. So in this case, I have 1, 2. If I wanted to tighten it down a little bit more, periodically I might slip stitch one more time. And what that does is just eliminates one more row of ribbing. So it just tightens it up a bit. It'll fit your forearm a little bit tighter. But for now, I'm just going to slip stitch 2 and then turn to work in the opposite direction. And this is exactly what we did before in row 2. So you're working into the back loop of all your stitches after you skip over the first 2 slip stitches. So that's the first V here, the second V here, and then I'm working under the back loop only of all of these single crochets until I get to the last stitch of the row, in which case I'm then working under both loops. And then we're just going to work back and forth like that around this foundation round until we have worked into all of the single crochets in our foundation round. When you've worked all the way around the sleeve, you should have something that looks like this. And what's important about finishing here is that your yarn ends up down at the bottom of the sleeve. So that means in some cases you may have to slip stitch more or fewer stitches here in order to end on a row like this. In this case, I just slip stitched 3 to end instead of 2, and then worked to the end of my row because I want my yarn to be positioned here in order to seam these 2 edges together. And we're going to want to turn our swancho inside out in order to do this seaming. So we're just turning it so that in the main fabric, our double crochet sides, we're seeing the wrong side of those. And when I do that, my working yarn is going to be tucked inside the sleeve, but that's okay because we're just going to work a few stitches and you can just kind of tug it through. So now I have the wrong side of my fabric facing. And what we're going to do is slip stitch along this edge in order to join the first row of our ribbing and the last row together. And because our working yarn is inside the sleeve, if you find it easier just to pull out a good chunk of it and then fasten off your yarn, just cut it here. That's what I'm going to do. And now I just have this tail I'm going to work with. You only need enough yarn to complete these stitches. So from here, we are going to be working under specific loops in order to create the most seamless join here when we turn our project right side out. And for me, I have, in this example, I have my first row of ribbing closest to me and the last row of ribbing further away from me. But even if you're working on the other side of your project and it's the opposite of this, the main thing to know is that we're working under the loops of our foundation chain and then under the outer loop of our last row. So even if this was facing this way, the outer loop would be the one that's not inside the sandwich of the seam. I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So I've chained one and I'm just going to insert my hook under this first foundation chain and then under the outer loop of my last row. I'm going to point at that outer loop here with a knitting needle so you can see what I'm talking about. It's the loop that is not in the middle of my seam. So I'm going to work in each chain and then only under the outer loop for each of my slip stitches as I work this seam. This is what that looks like. I've already worked under this front one, so now I'm working only under the outer loop of the back, and then I'm just pulling up a loop and pulling it through the loop that's on my hook. That's a slip stitch. So now I'm working under that chain loop and then under the outer loop of my last row. Again, if this is the opposite for you and what you have closest to you is that last row, you're just going to be working under the outer loop of it and then through your foundation chain. We want to keep this fairly tight because we don't want big gaps when our seam is stretched, but we're also not trying to make it bunchy. So your intention here is fairly important. And if you find when you turn this right side out that you don't like how it looks, it's definitely worth redoing it because this is just a quick little part, but it really will influence how you feel about the finished project. So now I'm working under that chain and then under the outer loop, just pulling up a loop and pulling it through the loop on my hook. Again, under my foundation chain, under the outer loop, yarning over and pulling up and then pulling it through right there. So we're going to continue like this until we've joined all the stitches in this little ribbing section. If you feel more comfortable safety pinning or using stitch markers to pin this together as you work or before you work, that is a great way to do it. Give yourself a backup to make sure you're lining up your stitches. I'm sort of just winging it because I feel pretty confident I can hold this together in a short row like this. So I'm just working through each one. You can do the same and then we'll meet back here when we get to the end of this seam. When you've worked through all the stitches of your ribbing, I suggest popping a stitch marker in here and just turning your sleeve right side out to evaluate the seam. My seam is right here and I think it's looking pretty good. It's quite seamless, and especially with some blocking, this is going to lay flat and I'm happy with how it looks. So if that's how you feel also, then all you need to do is just yank your yarn tail through. If you haven't yet cut it, cut your yarn and then pull it through so that you fastened off, and then you're able to weave in this end because this sleeve is complete. And now you'll want to go complete the same steps for the sleeve foundation and then the ribbing on the opposite armhole. And we'll come back here and talk about the bottom trim. Cute sleeves. Now it's time for us to extend the length and create a bottom border. So we're going to rotate our sweater around like this, and we're going to attach the yarn in either underarm section. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I am going to work right here under this underarm, and it's almost hard to tell where the seam is because it's so invisible, but it's directly below the sleeve. You can see here that I have my chain rows joined together. So I'm going to begin by inserting my hook in one of these chain space row edges. So this entire round here, all the way around the bottom of the sweater, is going to be worked into our row edges along this right here. So this is going to be a very long round. It has a lot of stitches in it, and I recommend having some stitch markers handy so that you can mark off every 30 or 50 stitches, and that just makes counting easier and requires less recounting, hopefully. I'm going to attach my yarn right here. Because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start working in this direction. So my seam is right here, and in my first chain space row, I am attaching my yarn, and I just like to have a slip knot on my hook and then pull up a loop. So I'm essentially slip stitching the yarn to my project, and then it's attached, and we're going to work this entire round in double crochet. So our first stitch is going to be a chain 3, and that will count as our first double crochet. I should also mention, we are using our larger hook for this section. So if you still have your smaller hook in your hand from your sleeves, switch back to that larger hook, and we're going to work in a general sequence that I'm going to teach you now. But what is more important than the exact placement of the stitches is that we end up with a certain stitch count. That is going to depend on your size, but we want that stitch count because the next round is going to depend on it. So even if you get to the end of one side and you realize, oh, you're off by a couple stitches, you can just fudge it a little, put a couple stitches extra here or there. That's fine because we're really just aiming for that total stitch count. The general pattern though is to work 1 double crochet in all the chain space row edges, and then 2 double crochets in all of the row edges of our taller rows, which are our double crochet rows. So this is what that looks like. We have 1 double crochet right here in that chain space row. So now I'm going to put 2 in my next row because it's one of our double crochet rows, and then I'm in a chain space row right here, so I'm going to work 1 and then 2. So we're just alternating 1 stitch and then 2 stitches, and what we want to do is on the 7th double crochet row, we're going to actually work 3 stitches in. So I've worked 1 double crochet row here, 1 double crochet row here, and so I'm going to do a few more of those until I've completed 7. And again, in the chain spaces, I'm just putting 1 stitch. And then double crochet rows, I'm putting 2. At this point, I have worked into 6 double crochet rows. So we're going to work 3 stitches in our next double crochet row. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so then I already placed a double crochet in my chain space row, and now I just want to work 3 stitches in here. The only reason we're doing this is that it's a nice way to help ensure we reach that stitch count that we're aiming for. But if you forget and you do it on the 8th one, that's probably fine also, because at the end of the round, like I said, we just need the total number of stitches. So what we're going to do now is repeat this sequence. So you're going to just always put 1 stitch in your chain space edges and then 2 stitches in the double crochet rows, and every time you've worked 6 double crochet rows, then you're going to put 3 stitches in the 7th double crochet row. That sounds like a mouthful, but we're just going for the stitch count. If that's the only thing you take away from this, look in the pattern and meet that stitch count, you'll be good to go. And as I mentioned, it's really helpful to put a stitch marker every certain number of stitches as you go so that you don't have to keep recounting all of them. So in this case, I'm going to put a stitch marker in my 30th stitch, and then my 60th stitch and my 90th stitch. So I'm placing a marker every 30 stitches. That will help with my counting, and we're actually working in a stitch multiple of 30, so it also helps me just make sure that I end up with a total number of stitches that I need. So now we're going to continue across the entire front or back, whichever you're joined on, it doesn't matter. We're going to work all the way across this row until we're at the opposite underarm. I'm coming up on my side seam here, so it's right here, and I wanted to point out that there is one last chain space row before you get to your seam. So I'm going to pop a double crochet in there, And then I want to work 1 double crochet into my seam. So you can just kind of insert your hook wherever it will fit, work a stitch in there, and now you want to just double check your counting and compare it to the number in the pattern. So in the pattern, we have it separated by the number of stitches you should have in your front and your back, whichever. It's reversible, so it doesn't matter what you're working on right now, but the idea is that it's really helpful to check halfway through the round and make sure you have the right number of stitches so that you just eliminate the risk of getting to the end and being off by much. So if you are on track and you've met the number of stitches you need, then just carry on in the same pattern. We're just going to start right here like we did at the beginning of the opposite side. We'll move on from our seam here and work 1 double crochet in this chain space and then 2 double crochets in here. We're kind of restarting our sequence right here. So you can start counting your double crochet rows and work 3 stitches into the 7th one as you go right here. And if you're off by a couple stitches, my suggestion is just to work them in, if it's just 2 or so, work them into this last little section here by increasing or decreasing the frequency of stitches right here. It's not going to make a huge difference, but it is really helpful if you get an accurate stitch count at this midway point because it'll make the rest of this round easier. So let's continue like this and I'll meet you back at the beginning of the round. All right, I'm coming to the end of my round here, and that was a lot of counting, wasn't it? So we want to double check here. If you haven't counted twice, my suggestion, as painful as it might feel, is to go back, make sure that between each marker you have the number of stitches, if it's 30, if it's 50, whatever you're keeping track by. Really double check this number because it's going to make the next round a lot easier. And I ended up with 1 less stitch than I needed, so I just popped an extra one in right here. So now I am just needing my last 2 stitches, and I wanted to demonstrate where those go. We have 1 more chain 3 space here. We should all have that. So it's going to be your second to last stitch of the round. And then we're going to put 1 stitch in the seam, just like we did on the opposite side. So we began here in a chain space row, and we're ending in the seam. So we've officially worked all the way around, and now I'm just going to work into the top of my turning chain with a slip stitch to join my round. So I'm just pulling up a stitch, pulling it through like that. So now you should have the total number of stitches that you need for your round, and that is going to allow us to transition to making a really beautiful undulating wave pattern, sort of a ripple. And we're going to turn our work and work in the opposite direction. So we're working in turned rounds here. What we just worked was a right side round, so as we turn and work in the opposite direction, we're going to have a wrong side round. I would suggest putting a stitch marker in your first stitch of this round, and that'll make it really clear where we began and allow us to know where to finish very easily. So we are going to work a 30 stitch multiple, which means we're going to do a certain sequence of stitches that is going to happen over 30 stitches, and then we're going to repeat that several times around the bottom of our sweaters. In this round, we're establishing our wavy ripple pattern, so we're going to work some shorter stitches to progressively taller stitches and then back to shorter stitches and then repeat that process. So we're going to begin with a single crochet, and I want to work that in the top of this chain, this turning chain. So it's kind of a funny spot, but I want to make sure I'm inserting my hook in the top of that turning chain. I chained 1 to start this round, so I've got a single crochet, and I'm going to pop the stitch marker in here so that I know where my round started. And we're now going to work 4 stitches that are similar, and then 4 more stitches that are similar, and 4 more. So we started with 1 single crochet, and now we want to work 3 more. 3 and 4. And then to increase the height a bit, we're going to work 4 half double crochets. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we're going to work 4 double crochets. So we're still increasing the height a little bit. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in the PDF, you'll find a stitch chart for this sequence. So if it's easier for you to visualize how this is working, that's a great tool to look at. We're now going to work 5 stitches in treble crochet. So that is just one more yarn over than a double crochet. So with a double crochet, we start with 1 yarn over. Now we're going to start with 2, and then keep going until our yarn overs are completed. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. That makes it treble, like 3. So I just worked 1 stitch. I'm going to yarn over twice, insert my hook, pull up a loop, and then yarn over and pull through 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. That's 2 stitches. Yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over and pull up a loop, and pull up a loop. 3. So now we have 3, and then, whoops, I need to yarn over twice. 1, 2, and 3, and then we need 1 more treble. 1, 2, and 3. So let's double check. We have 5. We can tell this is where things get a little taller here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're going to work back in double crochet because we're going to start going down our slope here. So we want 4 double crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 4 half double crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you'll notice the only stitch where we work anything other than 4 stitches is that middle section of treble crochet. Now we want 4 single crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the last stitch in this repeat is a slip stitch. So it is the flattest of all stitches. It's got the lowest height, and that just looks like inserting my hook, pulling up a loop, and then just pulling it through the loop on my hook. So it's even shorter than a single crochet. Now I've officially finished 1 sequence. You can see I have a nice little point developing. Next, I would work that same sequence we just did. So 4 single crochets, 4 half double crochets, 4 double crochets, and then those 5 treble crochets, 4 double crochets, 4 half double, 4 single crochet, and then 1 slip stitch. So that should occupy 30 stitches. If you're ever not sure, count your stitches there. If you're not sure which stitch you missed, you may have to tear it out, but you can check your work by making sure you have 30 stitches to make your wave. And you're just going to repeat that sequence around this entire round until we end up back here where our stitch marker was placed in the very first stitch. Just like in other parts of this pattern, it can be extremely helpful to use stitch markers to save yourself a little bit of hunting and counting. So I like to put a stitch marker in my slip stitch to indicate the end of the repeat. And again, there should be 30 stitches in each repeat. So if you'd like, you can just use the stitch markers you placed in the previous round to indicate your 30 stitch increments. And that'll be just another mile marker to double check yourself and make sure you're on track. I'm at the end of my round here. You can see my stitch marker from where we began. And so I've worked my 4 single crochets, and I'm going to end with a slip stitch into my last spot there, that last stitch. So now I've completed even repeats of 30 stitches. And I want to just slip stitch to my very first stitch of the round to join this. So I'm just going to insert my hook under that first single crochet, pull up a loop, and pull it through. Now it's going to be really important once again to remember where our first stitch is, and I'm going to just put this in here so that we can keep an eye on it, but I'll move this very shortly. It's more for the purposes of illustrating where that stitch is, because it's going to be important to think about where our repeat begins as we head in the opposite direction. So I'll show you what I mean here. We want to turn, because we're going to work back the other way now. This is going to be a right side row, and we're going to continue in this undulating wave pattern. Now we're going to work only in double crochet. So we're going to follow the curves we've already created. only in double crochet, but in a couple spots we're going to do something other than just one double crochet. So down at the bottoms, the valleys, we can call them, we will be doing a double crochet 3 together. So that is taking 3 stitches, merging them into one. And then at the peaks, the center treble crochet, the middle stitch of our repeat there, we'll be putting 3 double crochets in. So that's just going to accentuate this curve and follow the line we've already established. And if you look at where we're starting here, where this green stitch marker is, we are in a valley. It's a bit hard to see with how much is going on here, but we've got a peak here and a peak here. So because we're in a valley, we need to do a decrease, which is double crochet 3 together. And the reason that I'm putting this stitch marker here, just so we can remember what's going on visually, is that we want to decrease over 3 stitches the very first stitch of the row, which is what we're considering ourselves right above here where my hook is. The green marker is marking that stitch. And then we want to work into the slip stitch that we just did. I just demonstrated to you. Not the one that was joining the round, but the last slip stitch of our repeat. And then in the next single crochet. Once we work this a couple times, I think this will be a lot clearer. To begin our double crochet 3 together, we're going to chain 2. So typically we'd chain 3 to represent 1 double crochet, but because we're doing this double crochet 3 together, that's a DC3 TOG. That's how it's abbreviated in the pattern. That just stands for double crochet 3 together. So this is 1/3 of it. Then we're going to yarn over and insert our hooks into that last stitch of the round, which was our slip stitch. These can be a little bit tight to work into. Slip stitches just tend to be tighter. So I'm going to yarn over and pull up a loop and then yarn over and pull through. But instead of yarning over again and finishing my double crochet, I'm going to keep 2 loops on the hook, and we're going to insert our hook in the next stitch before we yarn over and pull through. So I'm yarning over again. Here I'm working into my single crochet. This is the first single crochet, yarn over, pull up a loop. So now I have 3 loops on my hook. I've created essentially 3 stitches in the first single crochet, the slip stitch, and the next single crochet. And then I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3. So I took 3 stitches and turned them into 1. Now we want to move our stitch marker right here because this is going to be the beginning of this round. Now we're going to double crochet to that middle treble crochet. So that means we need to do a total of 13 double crochets as we work our way up there. After 13 double crochets, we're at our center stitch in our repeat. So this is that center treble crochet. So here we're going to work 3 double crochets all into the same stitch. And you may notice here, this is the basics of a ripple pattern. And the way a ripple pattern works is you decrease the same number of stitches in the valley, and then you increase the same number of stitches in the peak. So that's what we're going to do now to accentuate the curve we established. Once I have those 3 double crochets in my middle stitch, now I can do 13 more double crochets down the slant working toward my valley. After 13 double crochets, this is where our decrease becomes a little easier to envision. I have a stitch marker in my slip stitch here that was sort of separating my repeats in the previous round. So I'm going to remove that. And that is the center of where we're going to double crochet 3 together. So I want to work into this single crochet, this slip stitch, and this single crochet. And again, I'm going to take those 3 stitches and merge them into one. So the way that looks is to yarn over and insert my hook, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. So it's almost as if I'm double crocheting, but I'm just not completing the last step. Now I'm going to yarn over again, work into that tight slip stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. So now I have 2 stitches that have been worked into, and then again, yarn over, insert my hook, pull up a loop, yarn over and pull through. So now I have my original loop that was on there, and then 1, 2, 3 stitches that I was working on combining. So I can yarn over and pull through all of those, and we've now turned 3 stitches into 1. So it can be helpful to keep these decreases marked. You don't have to, but if you like to have a little bit of a note to yourself, this is kind of like a little sticky note giving you a reminder of where you're at in your sequence. And from here, it's quite straightforward because we're just going to work 13 more double crochets. And then when we get to that middle treble crochet, we'll put 3 double crochets in it. Again, work 13 double crochets till we get to the valley. And then again, I have the stitch marker here. We're going to do a double crochet 3 together over those 3 stitches, and then up the next side, 13 double crochets, 3 double crochets in the middle treble stitch, again 13 down, and double crochet 3 together. So you now know all the steps, and your only job is to work this repeat around all the way until you get back to our original starting place. And then definitely hold up your top because it is looking so pretty at this point. You're starting to see this really beautiful, soft, gentle wave at the bottom of the shirt, and it's only going to get prettier from here. When you've finished your final repeat, it's time to slip stitch to join to the first stitch of the round. If you remember, we put a stitch marker in the top of that double crochet 3 together. So that is this stitch right here, and we want to slip stitch into the top of it. So it's probably going to look like a slightly bigger than usual V, and I'm just going to pull up a loop and pull through. Now our round is connected, and in this case we actually need to do 1 more slip stitch in order to position our yarn for our next round. So I'm just going to slip stitch into the top of the next stitch. That's a double crochet. And now we're ready to work in the opposite direction. I'm going to chain 2 because again we're going to begin with a double crochet 3 together. So this chain 2 is like the first little leg of that decrease, and I don't really need to worry about my slip stitch necessarily because I'm replacing it with this 2 double crochet. So now I need to work the next leg of my decrease into the top of the next stitch. So I'm just yarning up and pulling up a loop and then yarning over again. So now I have those 2 legs here. I need 1 more. So what you should be working into for your 3rd stitch is a double crochet. There we go. So now we have once again done double crochet 3 together. I'm going to put a stitch marker in the top of that so we can remember specifically where it is. And this is where things get quite familiar because we want to do 13 double crochets again until we get to this peak, and then we will put 3 double crochets in that middle stitch. The placement of our peak where we put 3 double crochets is actually even easier to see on this round because we have our 3 double crochets from the last round and we just want to work this increase into our middle double crochet. So here, right here, I've worked 13 double crochets along my incline, and then I'm going to put 3 stitches here. That's going to become my peak now, and now again I want to work 13 double crochets down my slant. After those 13 double crochets are done, we're down in our valley again, and if you remember, I did put a stitch marker in the top of my double crochet 3 together. So that is now representing the middle stitch of my double crochet 3 together. So after you've worked 13 stitches, you should have 1 more double crochet and then your decrease from the previous round. And we're going to use the next 3 stitches to do our decrease. So I'm working into the top of that double crochet, working half of my stitch, and then continuing, working now into the top of the decrease from the previous round. So now I have 3 loops on my hook, and then once more I'm working into the next double crochet, and now 4 loops on my hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull through all of them, and again I have taken 3 stitches and turned them into 1. I'm going to put a stitch marker in the top there. I just like how it gives me some mile markers, but we should be creating a really nice point here, and we're going to continue like this around the rest of your sweater. So there should be 13 double crochets up one side and then 3 double crochets in your middle stitch. Again, 13 double crochets down the side, and then you'll work that decrease over the next 3 stitches. Once again, 13 up, 3 in the middle, 13 down. So you can continue in that pattern. It's really a nice ripple pattern that's quite relaxing now that we've established it. And then I'll meet up with you at the end of the round. And at the end of the round, I want to show you a place that could be an easy spot to make a mistake. And in fact, I almost made this mistake. And if you just do a little bit of counting, you can prevent any issues here. So it is quite easy to look at this last spot, in my case, and think, oh, of course, that's a stitch I need to work into. And if you look really close, you turn it the other way, you see, oh, actually, this is being worked into there and the stitch has already been worked. But if I didn't look super closely and do some counting, I would have absolutely put a stitch there and then I'd be adding too many stitches. So one thing you can just check is making sure you have 13 double crochets after your increase up here where you put 3 in 1 stitch. So you should always have 13 on the down slope. And since I've already worked 13, that's what caused me to examine this a bit closer. And at any point in these rounds, if you are a bit confused about where you're at with things, just count your stitches, because that illuminates all things about this repeat. So now at the end of this, I am going to slip stitch to join it. And then just like we did on the previous round, we are going to again slip stitch into the next stitch just to position our yarn in the right place for the next round. From here, we are simply going to repeat round 4. So you can check the pattern for the number of rounds that you should be working for your size, but also this is a place where you can customize things because you can make your sweater longer or shorter based on the number of rounds that you add here. So I'm going to show you once again how to start this, and then you can just do some cruise control crochet as you work around this sweater 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more times. So as a reminder, we're starting with 2 chains here, and then I am skipping that little slip stitch I did, but I'm going to work into my next stitch. I yarned over, I'm going to pull up a loop and pull through. So now I have 2 of my stitches that I'm going to crochet together, and then one more time, yarn over, pull up a loop and pull through. So now I have 3. The only reason we don't have 4 loops on our hook at this point, as we usually do when we're doing double crochet 3 together, it's just because we're starting with this chain, this turning chain, instead of starting with a stitch already on our hook. So it's just a little bit different as we start our round like this. And if at any point you're confused about if you're working into the right stitches, I find it easy to flip this over, and then I can make sense of my stitches a little bit better. So from here, I want to just yarn over and complete my decrease, and now I can continue with 13 double crochets up my incline. So go enjoy some relaxing crocheting that you already have all the skills that you need to know for, and I will meet you back here when you're happy with the length of your swancho. The last thing you're going to do when you're happy with the length of your swancho is to work one final round around the entire bottom edge, just slip stitching in every single stitch. I like to do this with the right side of my project facing, so even if your last round was a right side round, my suggestion would be keep the right side of the fabric facing, slip stitch in each stitch all the way around, and slip stitch can have a tendency to get a little bit tight, so it's important when you're working this round of slip stitch to just keep your stitches fairly loose so that you're not artificially cinching in the bottom edge of your sweater. Now all that's left is to give your Marika Swancho a little bit of blocking love. My preferred method is to steam block, and I like to just focus on areas that may not be laying exactly flat. So that can be like the seam of your ribbed cuff, possibly these waves down below, and just hitting the whole project with a little bit of steam will help open up your beautiful lace stitches. And after that, I want you to try this puppy on with whatever you are wearing, because it's really truly looks good with almost anything. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy crocheting!